Hello Internet and welcome to Historical Headlines for the 17th of January. America take Denmark's virginity. Not safe for work. Now, the 17th of January is one of those dates around the year where tons of things have happened that I could have talked about. It's one of the more interesting and important dates of the year. I could have talked about, for instance, the beginning of Desert Storm. We could have talked about the, shall we say, closing of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Raoul Wallenberg was going missing that time. Popeye the Sailor Man first appeared in Thimble Theatre comic strip. There's a lot of things to talk about, but I've chosen to go back to 1917, where Denmark sold the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, to America for $25 million. And I'm doing this because while for America it might simply have been an easy way to get a couple of strategic islands in the Antilles, as well as a couple of vacation spots for people who want to go down there for some sun and some bathing, for Denmark it was actually a fairly important moment in our national history. For almost 200 years, the Virgin Islands had been important for Denmark from an economic perspective, as well as a flashpoint for several large cultural events. It was where we had our slaves, which is of course a dark moment in the history of any modern nation. It was also there that a very brave man who has never fully gotten the credit he deserved, Peter von Scholten, basically abolished slavery on his own in 1845. Despite all the backlash it gave onto him, and because of the slavery to a certain degree, it was, with all the sugar we grew out there, responsible for one of the most powerful major economic upswings in Danish history that allowed us to actually recover from the wars of the 17th and early 18th century that otherwise had us on the ropes. Now, since I'm Danish and we're talking about Danish affairs, you might have expected me to do the time traveling reporting myself. However, time travel seems to be making me nauseous, and it wouldn't do you any good if I were not capable of actually talking you through this momentous occasion. So we're setting it straight back over to our usual fallback guy, Tim Sateson. Thank you, studio. A bittersweet day for Denmark, as they have now finished the sale of the Virgin Islands to the United States of America. It will be remembered how this debate about whether or not to sell to the Americans have been going on almost since 1867. And in fact, a deal had been struck to sell them back in those days, but the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson got in the way, and later attempts to sell in the 1890s and the beginning of this century in 1902 has been thrown out of the window by the Danish parliament, as they could not bear to separate themselves from the islands that has been part of the realm for so long, where in fact the cities of St. Amalia and Christianstad was once some of the greatest in the Danish kingdom. So why would Denmark actually want to sell it, and why would America want to buy it? Well, America thought that this was a chance to get a place to put a very successful naval base within the Caribbean islands, as well of course as just to remove European influence from the American continent, something they have been very keen on for the last 100 or so years. But why would Denmark then sell the islands? Well, first of all, they are simply not making the kind of money that they used to. Following the construction of beetroot plantations in Denmark itself, where the beets will grow, there is no longer need for the sugar plantations of the West Indies. You no longer need to ship the sugar across the Atlantic in order to get it. You can just grow it at home. Combined with the abolition of slavery and this decline in the island's economical prospects, it has become a drain on the Danish treasury. And yet, of course, despite this, most Danes are not exactly in favor of selling off parts of their realm, especially not parts of their realm that has been there for so long and has played such a pivotal part in our history. There are also those who say that we are abandoning the former slaves and descendants on the island, and that we should at least keep being there in order to lead them into a more prosperous future, because we have a duty to them since it was us who brought them in from Africa. But however, the deed is done. The sale is made. There is a clause in the sale, of course, that means that in 2017, in 100 years, Denmark can buy back the island for exactly the same price as America brought them here, but who knows what will happen then. For now, let us get a comment about this momentous occasion from the Danish minister Konstantin Brun, who is here in America to formally sign over ownership of the islands to the United States. Minister Brun, what is your opinion on this momentous occasion for Denmark's territorial possessions within the Western Hemisphere?
Well, we are of course sorry for the whole thing, but it was about time. We no longer make any money on these islands, and the United States could use them, so in the end it was a fine financial agreement.
I'm sorry, Mr. Minister, but perhaps if you could sound a little bit less like you were talking with a potato in your mouth, it might make it easier for our viewers and listeners to understand you.
Well, I do apologize for that, but that's just how the Danish language is spoken. Now you will excuse me, I have to go sign a piece of paper to transfer the island to the America.
Well, clear talk there from Minister Brun. I don't know why anyone would develop a language where you have to speak it with a potato in your mouth, but anyway, the sale is now final and we can only hope that the Americans truly understand what they have purchased and will use their limitless creativity to finally create a prosperous and financially stable future for the islands. Back to the studio. Thank you, Mr. Satan, though I think I would prefer if someone who was best described as a professional naked man did not in fact spend his time offending my mother tongue. Now, of course, from the American perspective, the sale itself was not actually the greatest success. The naval base was never constructed. In fact, in 1917, most of the idea of the naval base had already kinda gone out the window, and from an economical perspective, the Virgin Islands have actually probably been a net loss. All tax revenues raised, and most, of course, of the tourist income from there, are going to the local government, and America has, in all probability, in the last 102 years, lost quite a bit of money on the damn thing. But of course, from there to get rid of the islands again, there is a long step. There was actually some light-hearted discussion in Denmark back in 2017 about whether or not we should put down $25 million in gold and say, hey, we want our islands back, because the original treaty allowed for it, but it never got beyond the joke stadium, which is again probably economically good for Denmark at this point, though personally I wouldn't necessarily mind having a couple of vacation islands out in the Caribbean, where I could also go to study some of the ancient Danish history that I actually studied in college. Now, this is in fact why I'm making this video, because this was some of the things that I made university papers on, so you're all going to suffer through one of my more boring videos, probably because it's my personal interest. So there. Yeah. It is perhaps, since we talked about slavery, interesting to note that in 1917, the majority of the populace on the Virgin Islands were actually not that keen to switch to America. They knew Denmark, they knew we cared about them, they knew that following the abolition of slavery, we had actually done what we could to make things as well for the mostly, of course, at this point, black inhabitants of the islands as we possibly could within our financial abilities. And while, of course, they all became fairly loyal American citizens rather quickly, it's somewhat worth noticing that despite us having a slave past, our previous slaves, who there were still a few alive at any rate, was still not negatively positioned towards us. That is, of course, very pleasant for a nation to think about, that we have somehow managed to redeem ourselves in the eyes of the people who actually suffered. Even though, of course, nowadays, with the current political climate, there has been risen demands that we give public apologies for our slave past, but that's a completely different discussion. Anyway, to end one of my probably worst videos of all times, but a subject I felt I had to talk about on the day because of its influence on just Danish history as such and my personal interests. Today's historical headlines: America takes Danish virginity, not safe for work. Until tomorrow, where I will be back with another and hopefully a lot more interesting historical headline, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.